Hey, it's Justin with Blackcopper Woodworking. Today I show you how to take this redwood slab from an epoxy disaster and turn it into a beautiful coffee table. For this build I used MDF and tuck tape. We sealed all the sides with silicone. I typically place each screw about a foot apart. With such tight fitting molds, I slide the slab into the mold before screwing on the last panel. When mixing a 2-to-1 ratio, it's important to watch the swirls and miscoloring to see if your mix ratio is correct and that you are fully mixed before pouring. After mixing for 3 to 5 minutes, we poured into a separate bucket and started to mix our dye. After mixing, we went straight into pouring instead of allowing the epoxy to sit due to this technique we were using while pouring. Here we can see there are minimal bubbles, and I filled all the small voids, followed by filling the remainder of the large open space. There are many small pores and holes that release air bubbles, especially as the epoxy has its exothermic reaction. Wood also aspirates, which causes more micro bubbles to come out of the surface. By the time I left this night, there were no visible bubbles in the epoxy, and I left with good confidence. When I came back in the morning, I saw more bubbles than I've seen in any epoxy project so far. Not only were there bubbles on the surface, but large pockets of air came from underneath the wood in an unexpected way. This is most likely due to overheating of the epoxy, which allows air to be trapped under the surface. This epoxy disaster took about 3 days of straight labor. The first step to fixing your epoxy disaster is using a 6-inch jigsaw blade and cutting out the mass majority of the epoxy. You'll want to draw a line close to the edge of the wood and follow with the saw, knowing that the rest will be scraped off. I found the most effective way to remove the epoxy was a heat gun and a scraper. It's pretty easy to scrape the epoxy as your heat increases. This is a tedious and time-consuming process. The video is sped up about 20 times the original speed. It does take a long time, but eventually you'll start to see your progress. After completing a majority of the top and side of the slab, you want to flip it over so you can focus on the bottom. Continue to use your scraper until you're satisfied with the looks. Keep in mind you can leave some epoxy on the underside because it would easily leave the wood sealed and help with air bubbles escaping on your next pour. This is a long process, but stick with it and I think you'll have good results. As you start working closer to the edge of your wood, you'll need to be more careful so you don't start scraping into the wood itself. At that point, I suggest you use a wire or a nylon brush. The wire brushes are more abrasive than the nylon, so I use the wire brush to remove excess amounts of epoxy. To achieve a more finished look, you want to change to the nylon brush and start removing the remaining bits of epoxy. The closer you become to this wood surface, you want to continuously clean so you have a good view of what you're removing and what you want to leave. After brushing off the slab, I noticed there were still pockets of epoxy I was dissatisfied with. However, I did leave some pockets as they wouldn't be visible in the finished product. These deeper pockets will also help seal your work in those hard-to-reach places and result in less overall air bubbles. Here is a view after cleaning the slab with a damp microfiber towel. On the repour, I started with a 1-to-1 ratio by SuperClear. This company suggests always pouring the hardener first when you're mixing. The same goes with 1-to-1 as it does 1-to-2 ratios. Keep stirring until the epoxy turns completely clear. Transfer your thoroughly mixed epoxy into a new cup, and then you can start adding your dye. For the second pour, the client decided to go a little bit darker in case there were any excess bubbles. Redwood is a very porous species. This pour uses 3 drops of SuperClear's oil dye. Though I don't normally pour in layers, with extra safety in mind, I poured the first layer of 1-to-1 and allowed it to dry until firm and tacky. The remainder of the pours were 1-to-2 ratio of SuperClear liquid glass. I waited 2 days between each pour of the liquid glass to assure a solid yet tacky surface to bond with. I mixed a small amount of black mica powder to add some depth to this epoxy instead of just a clear glass look. While the epoxy was drying, we started working on our 3D designs as well as the tabletops for the 2 end tables in this trio. A Miles Craft router jig is a great way to cut circles at 24 inches in diameter. This thick slab was a challenge, so I used a Tools Today 3-inch down spiral bit to cut the shape of these circles. I finished these off with a flush trim router. Scrap cutoff pieces can be used to match the diameter and evenly sand the outside of these circles. I used a white side 1.5-inch end mill to flatten both of these tabletops. The smaller bit allows for less cut lines when flattening your slab on a CNC machine. To make a mold for the circular end table, I used plastic landscape edging and sealed the edges with a silicone. While this table was drying, we moved back to the large coffee table. You know your table is ready for its next pour if it's firm but still lightly tacky. Pouring in layers lowers the possibility of bubbles and allows you to better control your epoxy's progress. There was one small leak which we fixed with paper towels and a stapler to dam up the epoxy and stop it from leaking further. The nice thing about landscape edging is it can be reused multiple times. The epoxy does not stick to it at all. After removing this end table from the mold, it was ready to be placed on the CNC so it could be flattened to the same thickness as the other end table. After waiting 2 days, I poured the next layer of epoxy, and while that was hardening, we started working on the 3D design for the coffee table base. We typically do our 3D designs in Fusion 360, which is a fluid program. This is a cross-styled base, which is pretty well known. We first designed it with 2-inch tubing and later changed it to 3 by 1-inch tubing. A plasma machine was used to cut out the top of these bases so that we could have a perfect platform for mounting and we would know exactly where to weld these legs. Whether using a router or a plasma, we always trust Avid CNC. Justin with Short Fuse Engineering helped weld this base together. I used high-tech coatings for the powder coat. I also managed to grab some cool photos while Justin was doing his work. Here you can see that there are essentially no bubbles in this table. This process really allows for a pure epoxy pour. 2-to-1 epoxy typically dries within 72 hours. I often give it another day or two before I peel the mold off. But here we can see how clean the epoxy pour turned out. Here's a walk-around view of the table. There are hardly any bubbles in the surface, and what remain will be planed off with the Avid CNC. A little pro tip for you all is using a hot glue gun to secure your slab to the table. Hot glue is better than relying on screws and doesn't leave any holes in your spoil board. I'd like to give a special thanks to Redneck DIY for allowing us to use his Avid CNC. While flattening a slab, we run at about 200 inches per minute and about 12,000 RPMs on the spindle. On this table, I'm using a Festool 150 ETS and Mirka mesh discs. It's important to not press too hard into your work while you're trying to flatten out those little tool marks on your table. Even if that is taking away material like you want it to, you can add divots into the wood and deep pigtails. I used a Rotex in order to get the tabletop to 125, and then I started using my track saw to cut all the sides to the shape that I was happy with. It's important to cut slow with the track saw to achieve a nice finish. Once you use this tool, you'll realize how smooth it cuts. Here's a slow motion shot showing exactly how this track saw works. I love the track saw because it keeps your cut exactly where you've secured the track, and it makes perfectly flat cuts with minimal sanding needed. Anytime you're working with epoxy, you will find small pits. For this, I use Star Bond and an activator. Here are the edges after sanding to 180. I then proceeded to finish this table, going up to 400 grit using a soft pad for the finishing grits. I mocked up the table with the base in order to see how it would look as a finished product. When using threaded inserts, you'll want a brad point drill bit to mark the position of the holes. I drilled them to the depth needed for the Rampatech threaded inserts. Drilling into epoxy is a little more risky than the wood, but if you oversize your bore slightly and are careful, your epoxy should be fine. Rampatech is a great company which provides threaded inserts and bolts at various sizes to fit all of your projects. I place a small amount of CA glue on each threaded insert. CA glue helps secure and reduce possible cracking of the wood or epoxy. The best part of any project is applying your finish. For this table, I'm using Odies Oil Dark, their super duper version, which really goes a long way, so be careful not to waste too much. For this table, I applied 2 coats of the super, followed by a layer of Odies butter. I buffed the Odies Wood Butter, and after drying for about an hour, I buffed it back off using white pads. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe to my channel. Blackcopper's social media accounts are listed in the description, along with product links for the tools and material used. Thanks for watching.